Hello YouTube! Today we're talking about the far-spreading effects of the Oblivion Crisis and how it's essentially the root of most of the problems that Tamriel faces in the 4th era around the time of Skyrim. I think it's a pretty interesting topic, so let's immediately start with the video. So, the Oblivion Crisis. As most of us know, the Oblivion Crisis was the invasion of Tamriel by the Daedric forces of the Daedric prince Mehrunes Dagon, after the Emperor and all his heirs were assassinated in the final year of the 3rd era. The Crisis is at the center of the plot of the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, and during the game you help Martin Septim, last of the deceased Emperor's children, stop the Crisis and seal Tamriel forever against the invasion of the Daedra. Happy ending, you save the world, everyone's happy, and Tamriel will never be in trouble again. Except no, it's not, because despite Martin Septim and you, the player, stopping the Oblivion Crisis, the effects of the Crisis were so devastating that the damage it did to Tamriel was irreversible, and despite the Crisis ending, it happening in the first place set off a chain reaction of events, which to this day on Tamriel can still be felt, and is at the very core of most of the problems on Tamriel at the moment. So let's start with the origin of the Crisis itself. In order to instigate the Oblivion Crisis, followers of the Daedric prince Mehrunes Dagon, called the Mythic Dawn, assassinated the Dragonborn Emperor Uriel Septim VII and all his known heirs. This left the Empire initially leaderless and extinguished the dragon fires which kept Tamriel safe from the threat of Oblivion and its Daedric princes. If you want to know more about how this works with the Dragonborn Emperors and the Dragon Fires, I recommend that you watch my introduction to the Elder Scrolls lore. A link to that is in the description. Anyway, what you need to know is that when the dragon fires were extinguished after the assassination of the Emperor, the protective veil between Nirn and Oblivion was suddenly vulnerable, and the Daedric Prince of Chaos, Mehrunes Dagon, broke through it, invading Tamriel to his Oblivion gates and spreading all his minions around to just kill, destroy and spread chaos all over Tamriel. Without an emperor, the Empire, then still spanning all of Tamriel, was leaderless and in peril. The High Chancellor of the Elder Council, a high elf named Okato, became the de facto leader during this crisis, as the people looked for a leader to guide them through the crisis, and he had the most central authority. If you want to know more about Okato, I made a whole video about him, it's in the description of this video. High Chancellor Okato did what he could to preserve the Empire, and for one of the most defining things that he and the acting Elder Council did, which would influence Tamriel for the next few centuries, was deciding that the central province of Cyrodiil needed to be protected in favor of the other provinces, as the central authority of the Empire rested in Cyrodiil. This meant that Imperial legions were pulled from several provinces in order to protect Cyrodiil. We don't know the exact troop movements, but we know that legions were pulled from Morrowind, elsewhere, Blackmarsh, and perhaps the Somerset Isles in order to protect the Imperial heartland. This decision would prove to be one of the most influential decisions made in this period without an emperor, as it weakened several of the provinces, leaving some, like Morrowind, virtually defenseless against the Oblivion hordes. In several provinces, this created a feeling of resent against the Empire, as they obviously didn't feel very appreciated and felt like they played basically a second fiddle role to Cyrodiil. These sentiments would lead to Morrowind losing confidence in the Empire, meaning that the province would leave the Imperial sphere of influence in the future after the Empire failed to help them time and time again. As the weakness of the Empire after the Oblivion Crisis led to the Empire not being able to adequately help Morrowind when it was devastated again by a crisis, this time the eruption of the Red Mountain in the Red Year, which left the province even more weakened, uninhabitable in some places and generally starved the population. The Empire at this time, 5 years after the Oblivion Crisis, was unable to help, as they were still weak themselves and dealing with massive crises everywhere due to the devastation that the Oblivion Crisis brought just 5 years ago. During these years, the Empire was still being led by High Chancellor Okato, at that point Potentate Okato. Potentate Okato wanted to find a new emperor to lead and unite the Empire in the time of hardship, but in his 10 years of rule, which were the 10 years of complete chaos and economic crisis after the Oblivion Crisis, he failed to find a new emperor whom the Elder Council wanted to unanimously appoint. This was because the Oblivion Crisis had made it impossible to find a new legitimate emperor for all of Tamriel. You see, this is something else that the Oblivion Crisis caused, because before the Oblivion Crisis, an Emperor of Dragon Blood was needed to keep the dragon fires lit and protect the world against the threat of Oblivion. The Emperor's power and his legitimacy were based on him or her being able to protect Tamriel against Oblivion by lighting the fires, thus they had an almost divine right to rule. But now, after you and Martin solved this whole problem in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion by forever sealing the barrier between Earth and Oblivion, a Dragonborn Emperor was no longer needed to rule the Empire, meaning that the throne was fair game for anyone, and at that point there was no one with enough influence to claim legitimate rule over the Empire, except maybe Okato, and that's why he became potentate. You see, now that the Dragon Blood was no longer needed, even a Septim Emperor, even a full-fledged heir of Uriel Septim, would not have the legitimacy to rule anymore, as his Dragon Blood was no longer needed to protect the Empire, and to protect the world in that sense. Meaning that even if there was a Septim left to rule, the Elder Council may not even have accepted them as a legitimate ruler with a good claim to the throne, since everybody could just now claim the throne, since the Dragon Blood was no longer needed. Only Chancellor Okato at this point had some legitimacy with the people of Tamriel, as he steered the Empire through the crisis, and to the people he was sort of the new face of the Empire, and thus he accepted the role of potentate over the Empire, ruling it for 10 very difficult years after the Oblivion Crisis. But the problems didn't end there, because Okato's rule was weakened significantly by the lack of resources after the Oblivion Crisis, and due to his earlier decisions to pull legions from the provinces to protect the Heartland, resent had started to show its head in several different provinces. This would first culminate in Blackmarsh, where a faction named the Anselil took over the province and kicked out the remaining Imperial forces. This faction grabbed power after the Oblivion Crisis, when they and the other Argonians were left to fend for themselves without the Empire, something that they did very successfully, closing many Oblivion gates by themselves. But the Anselil used the confusion after the Oblivion Crisis to claim that it was not Martin Septim and the player of the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion who ended the crisis, but it was them who had some secret plan during the crisis, who ended the crisis, and that they were the actual cause for the end of the crisis. They branded the Empire's claim that Martin ended the crisis a lie and spread their own propaganda across Argonia, that they were the one who ended the crisis. This created anti-Imperial sentiments, especially since the Empire left them alone during the crisis by pulling legions out, which allowed them to take power eventually. Which allowed the Anselil to take power. If you want to hear this story in more detail, I made a video on the Anselil, which is in the description. But the Anselil then, also after taking power, invaded Morrowind as a revenge upon the Dark Elves who enslaved the Argonians for years. And during this invasion, Okato was not able to help Morrowind with Imperial forces against the raging Argonians, once again leaving the province to basically fend for themselves, and once again being left alone by the Empire in their time of peril. This caused House Lalu, the most pro-Imperial great house of the Dunmer, to be ousted from the Council of Morrowind, and caused them and the Empire to become scapegoats for all of Morrowind's problems, causing Morrowind to basically permanently get a very bad taste for the Empire. And the Anselil weren't the only faction to lie about the ending of the Oblivion Crisis, as in the Somerset Isles, another anti-Imperial faction named the Thalmor was able to grow very influential by claiming that they secretly ended the Oblivion Crisis, claiming that to their people, and not Martin, also using this lie to gain influence and eventually overthrow the pro-Imperial monarchy in the Somerset Isles. Many believe that the Thalmor were the ones who eventually also assassinated potentate Okato after his 10 years of rule, although we don't have definitive proof for that. His death, though, quickly led to infighting in the Empire after he was assassinated, civil wars and complete collapse of the Empire's authority for a while on all of Tamriel. This was a 7-year period of infighting following Okato's assassination, and it was called the Stormcrown Interregnum, and it weakened the Imperial influence across all the provinces and made it so that when a new emperor rose to power, a conqueror named Titus Mede, he had to reconquer most of the human provinces, even needing to fight wars in Cyrodiil itself to re-establish his authority as emperor on the continent. His conquest as emperor was quite successful, and he managed to basically reconquer all the human provinces and Valenwood and renegotiate a joining of Somerset Isles into the Empire with the pro-Imperial monarchy on the Somerset Isles. Only Elsewhere and Blackmarsh remained outside of this new conquered empire, with Morrowind's status being quite vague and unknown in this. We don't really get conclusive proof on whether they were in or out at that point. Anyway, good times for the new emperor. Except no, not good times. Because the Thalmor, who were very anti-imperial in their sentiments, overthrew the Somerset monarchy, who were pro-imperial, and declared independence from the empire. And several years later they also overthrew the pro-imperial governments of Valenwood in a coup, causing the empire to lose authority over Valenwood as well, as Valenwood was being incorporated into the new Thalmor-led state, the Altmerry Dominion. A cold war then started on Tamriel between the Empire and the Altmeri Dominion. The two states were basically each other's silent enemies, as it's called in the Elder Scrolls novels, despising each other deeply, and one could only wait until a war would break out between the two, and that war would, as most of us know, eventually come. After more than 100 years of silent Cold War, and eventually Elswere's entrance into the Altmeri Dominion as client states, the Great War between the Empire and the Altmeri Dominion would ravage over the entire face of Tamriel, leaving both states scarred, ending with the White Gold Concordat, which banned Talos worship, which created the civil war in Skyrim. If you look at it like that, you can see that even in Skyrim, 200 years after the Oblivion Crisis, Tamriel is still scarred and permanently changed by the effects of the Oblivion Crisis. Most problems Tamriel faces now find their root in the crisis, because, for example, the civil war in Skyrim and the Stormwatchers this year in Skyrim, they were caused by the White Gold Concordat, which was caused by the Great War, which was caused by the Thalmor, who were able to rise to power because of the Oblivion Crisis. The current weakness and fall of Morrowind, what about that? Well, if the Empire hadn't pulled its resources out of the province due to the Oblivion Crisis, they wouldn't have been devastated by the Oblivion Crisis, meaning that they would have had far more resources to help themselves when the eruption of the Red Mountain happened, and the Empire would have had resources to aid Morrowind with the rebuilding, and the Ancilil would have never risen to power without the Oblivion Crisis in Blackmarsh, meaning that there would have never even been an invasion of Morrowind by the Argonians. The massive killings in Valenwood of Bosmer that were not loyal to the Thalmor, well, those Bosmer would never have had to rise up against the Thalmor if there were no Thalmor, who likely would not have been there without the Oblivion Crisis. The Orcs, being forced to move Orsinium, their homeland, well, if the Empire hadn't been weak after the Oblivion Crisis, the Orcish homeland would not have been able to be raided during the Stormcrown Interregnum, because it would have been properly protected by the Empire, which it had been during the Septim days. But it wasn't, meaning that after the assassination of Potentato Kaito and Chaos ruled in the Empire, Orsinium was able to be raided and destroyed, with the only orcs surviving the massacre being saved by the Imperial legions who had no central coordination from a war-torn Cyrodiil, where just, again, Chaos ruled in the Empire. Even smaller problems like the Forsworn uprising in the Reach in Skyrim, if the Great War hadn't happened, that would not have happened, and if the Thalmor hadn't risen, the Great War may not have happened, and if the Oblivion Crisis hadn't happened, the Thalmor wouldn't have happened. My point is that even though the Oblivion Crisis was solved by the player and Martin Septim in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, its effects were permanent, and the damage had long been done. The invasion had been stopped, but a chain reaction of events which would plague Tamriel for centuries to come had already started. It all started the moment that all the Dragonborn Emperors were assassinated, and that chain started, ultimately leading to Tamriel being ravaged by a massive war between the Empire and the Dominion, and Skyrim being torn into a civil war. Perhaps all this information was not new to you, but it was a very important realization to me personally, and I felt like it was worth making a video on, as, I don't know, the idea of basically the plot of Oblivion still influencing the events of Skyrim 200 years later, and the fact that even though you solved the Oblivion Crisis and you stopped everyone from dying, that doesn't mean that the problems were solved, and that doesn't mean that the chain reaction, which would eventually throw Tamriel into chaos, didn't already start. That said, that was today's video. If you enjoyed it, consider returning for the next time for the next Elder Scrolls lore video. And as always, before I end things, allow me to vocally mention my top Patreon supporters: Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Athena Iotis, Polaris Potin, Tsar Mikhail, Sort of Bushido, and Mr. Crispus. These amazing people, along with all the others on screen, keep this channel alive, and for that I am very grateful. That said, I will see you all next time in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Bye bye.